welcome everyone to the final keynote address, which is the culmination of the LSE Future of Humanity Summit. You have heard 4 panels today, ranging on climate change, on pandemic response, on artificial intelligence, and on general strategies to mitigate existential risks that we face as a collective human civilization. To wrap up the event then, we're having a keynote address from Mr. Daniel Ellsberg. Mr. Daniel Ellsberg is the whistleblower who released the Pentagon Papers in 1971. As a result, Mr. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act, along with other charges of theft and conspiracy, carrying a maximum sentence of 115 years. All charges were dismissed due to Mr. Ellsberg's defense and the misconduct and illegal evidence gathering by the government. In relation to the Watergate scandal, this led to the convictions of several White House aides and figured in the impeachment proceedings against President Nixon. This historical episode was, of course, made into several films, including most recently The Post, co-produced by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep. Since the end of the Vietnam War, Mr. Ellsberg has been a lecturer, scholar, writer, and activist on the dangers of the nuclear era, wrongful US interventions, and the urgent need for patriotic whistleblowing, for which he has appeared on the Colbert Report and written for The Guardian. As an author, Mr. Ellsberg went on to write 4 books, including The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. In the book, Mr. Ellsberg reflects on his job as a nuclear war planner for US Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, explaining that he could no longer live with himself without doing what he could to expose it, even if it meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Mr. Ellsberg was awarded a 2006 Right Livelihood Award for putting peace and truth first at considerable personal risk and dedicating his life to inspiring others to follow his example. Mr. Ellsberg, it is a pleasure to have you on board, and the floor is yours now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're talking about the future of humanity here, and I understand that there has already been discussion of various ways in which humanity might or might not become extinct. That's the question actually posed by Toby Ord in his new book that just came out, The Precipice, and in which he concludes, by the way, that nuclear war, which is going to be my subject tonight, is unlikely to make us extinct. I agree with that. So we can start on a positive note then. The experts that I rely on, environmental physicists like Alan Roebuck and Brian Toon, tell me, in response to my questions, very unlikely that even the worst nuclear war, and they are looking at a war that causes what has been called nuclear winter, and I'll explain that a little later, but the very, very serious effects would probably not result in the total extinction of humanity. Life would go on for humanity and even civilizations of a sort, and specifically in the Southern Hemisphere, in Australia and New Zealand, the old parts of the Commonwealth. And we could do it all again, in effect, later. So that's not the issue that I'm talking about tonight. In terms of the future of humanity, that is challenged by the existence of what I would call 2 doomsday machines, and possibly more than that, US and Russian, and possibly others of the 9 nuclear states. The issue then is not extinction, but let me approach it. I asked a question in 1961, a year when I was writing for the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, guidelines, top secret guidelines for the annual operational plans of the existing US nuclear forces, the Strategic Air Command principally. In the process of writing those guidelines, almost exactly, I finished my draft of the guidelines, in fact, on my birthday by coincidence, which was April 7th. We're approaching that very closely now, exactly 60 years ago, on the 60th anniversary of what I'm about to describe. Well, actually, that was the day I finished my guidelines. But on another day, I asked a question of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the name of the President. I didn't do that, of course, myself, but I provided some questions to the Deputy National Security Assistant, Robert Comer from Harvard, who was the deputy to McGeorge Bundy, the former Dean of Faculty at Harvard when I was there, graduated. And the question was related to, but not quite the same, as the first question, in my understanding, addressed to Theresa May, as she became Prime Minister. I was just reading, that was in 2016, 5 years ago. She was asked a question that apparently no Prime Minister had been asked directly before. At any rate, no Prime Minister had given a direct reply as she did. In fact, Foreign Secretary earlier had said no Prime Minister should be asked to answer such a hypothetical question. But she was asked almost surely because of two reasons. She was a woman, and they wanted to hear, let's say, reassurance, as they did hear from her answer to this question. And also because she wanted to distinguish herself from her rival, Corbyn, who would have given a different answer. The question was, would you be prepared to launch a nuclear war, to start a nuclear war that would cause the deaths of 100,000 innocent men, women, and children? And her answer was described as a humiliation for the Labour Party, something of a small triumph for her party. She answered with one word, yes. And that was the answer that was meant to embarrass many parties, many people in the Labour Party, whose leader, Corbyn, would have said no, that he had said he would not do such a thing. I didn't see any comment then or later on the fact that this is a virtually irrelevant question when you're talking about nuclear war. And let me go back now to many years later. Her question was 2016, well after, almost 2 decades after the ending of the Cold War. Mine was at the heart of the Cold War in 1961. It was going to get even worse. And the question was, if the Joint Chiefs, if you carry out your plan, your existing plan for nuclear war with Russia, with the Soviet Union, how many people would be killed in the Soviet Union and China? And I'll say that was meant to be a question that would embarrass them bureaucratically and make them more open to adopting this quite drastically modified plan that I was drafting for the president. In terms of their own plan, because I had been told they had no answer to that. They chose not to know exactly the answer to that, how many people would be killed. And to keep them from postponing an answer to that by saying, well, we need to figure out what happens in Albania, something else like that. I confined it just to the Soviet Union and China. And by the way, in those days, it was a secret fact that there was no plan for armed conflict with the Soviet Union that did not involve, under Eisenhower, hitting every city in China, as well as every city in the Soviet Union. So I asked, just for Russia, Soviet Union rather, and China, how many people would be killed by our operation, which was understood to be a preemptive attack, either coming out of a smaller scale beginning of a non-nuclear attack as over Berlin, or as a result of tactical warning. Our plan was to get off the ground, launch on warning, as it still is, by the way, first strike plan, in which the coordinated with Britain. And it was not to wait until enemy warheads had exploded on our missiles. It was to get over there first. I was wrong. They did have a calculation. It came back right away for their standards in a week, as opposed to much longer periods for other questions that I posed. It came in the form of a graph with the number of deaths on the vertical axis right away, and rising, a straight line. It's obviously a simple model, linear graph here that showed how many would die from fallout in the Soviet Union and China, month by month, with the fallout that would come out. And the amount on the graph was, for the first days or week, 275 million people, rising to 325 million people over 6 months. And that was from the blast, the prompt radiation, the heat immediately, and the fallout in the Soviet Union and China alone. Well, since they did have an answer to that, okay, well, let's expand. They had a model. Let's ask them, and they did. Homer asked them then, how many altogether in the world by our attack? And the answer came back in another week, again very quickly for them, now in the form of a table, no longer a graph. Another 100 million in East Europe, what we called during the Cold War the captive nations, the satellites, people occupied essentially by Russian forces, though formally allies of the Warsaw Pact, in which, by the way, we didn't target cities, as in Russia, but we targeted air defense to create channels, freeways for bombers to come in and do the real work. So the air defenses were all in cities, so the cities were hit anyway, and there was, of course, fallout from that. Another 100 million in West Europe, our allies, the NATO allies, 1961, a year of the Berlin crisis, by the way, from fallout from our attacks in Russia, Soviet Union, and East Europe, depending on which way the wind blew, as was testified in Congress, meaning essentially the season, the weather at that time, but it could be up to another 100 million. And finally, in areas contiguous to the Soviet Union and China, like Afghanistan, a very exotic place in those days. I could hardly have found it on a map, I would have to say. But also Austria, Finland, Sweden, and in the Far East, large parts of Japan and India. A total of 600 million people, 100 holocausts. Now, before I give my reaction to that, I should add, that was a very obviously a low estimate from their point of view, because they weren't including fire. Fire was too hard to calculate, and its effects depended on the weather, on the fuel loading where you were hitting, whether it was a ground burst or air burst, various things, so they didn't calculate it. And according to Lynn Eden and her very fine thesis, The World on Fire, they never have calculated that. But that would have added, not doubled it, but it would have added, got you up to about 1 billion people in their calculators. It was a known effect, they just hadn't calculated. The population of the world then was 3 billion. So this was a third of the population of the world. And as Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, used to say, and I've heard him say this when he was alive myself, yes, at most, a nuclear attack with H-bombs, thermonuclear weapons, could kill, sometimes he said, 1/4 of the Earth's population. He may have said at some point as much as 1/3. And the plan was for 1/3, for us, ourselves. That didn't involve attack on the US in retaliation, which in 61 might not have existed at all, because although the Strategic Air Command had recently estimated that year that the Soviets had 1,000 missiles, ICBMs, in fact, later that year, from our reconnaissance satellites, it turned out they had 4. SAC had overestimated by 250 times on that one. But in terms of Europe, They had medium-range missiles of the kind, by the way, that were banned later by Reagan and Gorbachev in the intermediate range missile. They had hundreds of those and intermediate range and airplanes of that range. As I say, those were banned, the missiles, from 78 or so to, 87, I forget exactly when that came in at this moment. But until this last year, when Russia and the US, starting with the US, abandoned that treaty. So that's open now for returning to those missiles. But those missiles were largely mobile, hidden in force. They couldn't be targeted adequately by our SAC, so they would reach Europe. And that would annihilate Europe as a result of our first strike, despite, in addition to the fallout by which we would annihilate Europe. It's never been quite clear to me whether the Europeans, including British, who have demanded assurance for decades now, many, many years, until now, of first use of the United States, by the United States, of nuclear weapons in the case of a military threat from the East. It's never been clear to me whether any of the Europeans actually fully absorbed what that meant from them, which was close to extermination. But at any rate, it was a threat. It wasn't a certainty. It was a possibility. It remains that way today. When under Obama in 2016, he was interested in a no first use policy, but that was there was pushback inside the American bureaucracy, but in particular from Secretary of State Kerry, who said that not only would Japan be concerned about being removed from the umbrella of the US ability to and commitment to initiate nuclear war if necessary, and from Poland and the Baltic states, who wanted the same kind of assurance we had always given to West Berlin, which had worked. West Berlin was not invaded. The Russians drew back. They could have done it very easily militarily. They had 22 divisions in the vicinity of West Berlin. There was no chance of our defending that by conventional means. But since we threatened sufficiently credibly that we would blow up the Northern Hemisphere, if they did that, it didn't happen. So it worked at the price of building up an ability to carry out that threat, which we've had ever since. Okay, coming back to Theresa May, the question she was asked, as they say, has no relation to the thermonuclear era that we've been living in since the mid-50s. 100,000 men, women, and children? That could be killed by certainly one warhead from a British submarine, from a Trident, one of the warheads on the missiles, and probably very close to that by the core, the fission core of one of the warheads, thermonuclear warheads. This late, it's been pretty much through the nuclear era. I think very few people really understand what happened in the mid-50s when we moved, late 50s, when we moved from A-bombs to H-bombs. I don't know how many people in this audience know the difference, because I can tell you that in America, very few people out of a large audience would acknowledge that they knew the difference between an A-bomb and an H-bomb, except that one might be larger. Which one? The way to explain that perhaps best is every H-bomb of the kinds that are on the Trident submarine right now, which has a very minimal loading down to 40 or so, often in one submarine, which could carry far more than 100, almost 200, down to 40. Every one of those has the H-bomb, the hydrogen or fusion bomb, thermonuclear bomb, as triggered by an A-bomb, the core of it, the so-called primary, the kind that destroyed Nagasaki. A slightly different kind of fission bomb, A-bomb destroyed Hiroshima, causing a firestorm. I'll mention why that's important. Just have a few more minutes here, but put this in context. Every H-bomb and all of the Trident warheads, like the American warheads and Russian, are thermonuclear H-bombs. It means they have an A-bomb, a Nagasaki-type bomb, as their detonator, their percussion cap. The Nagasaki bomb was about 20 kilotons, 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent. That's 1,000 times the explosive yield of the largest blockbusters of World War II, which got up, they called blockbusters because they could destroy a city block from some even 5 merited that term, but 10 tons, 15 tons. The British, I think, had a 20 or 22 ton bomb that could only be carried by a British bomber. We couldn't do it, the Lancaster, big enough to carry it. We had a lot of those. But the Nagasaki bomb in one bomb is 1,000 times the yield of that. That's the trigger for an H-bomb, which was first tested as a droppable weapon in '54 by the United States, a few years before the British got it, at 1,000 times the Nagasaki bomb. That's 1,000,000 times more than the blockbuster of World War II. Now, that was 15 megatons, actually, 15 million tons equivalent. The Russians tested one at 58 megatons, and it was really 2 stages of a larger bomb, a 100 megaton bomb, but they didn't set that off because it would have broken every window in Moscow, they said, as Sakharov warned Khrushchev. So they set it off at half yield. Now, most of the bombs are much less than that now, virtually all of them, in fact, because it's much more efficient at killing people to drop a number of smaller yield bombs and not waste too much of it going up into the air, but get it on the surface and get the fallout. Finally, one thing that was not taken into account by the the JCS in 1961, was something they had. It was a weapons effect that no one had calculated until 1983, more than 20 years after I was asking that question. But that was almost 40 years ago. And that was, that depended on the fact that a nuclear weapon would cause a firestorm, which was something that the British had tried to do in almost every attack they made, their night firebombing attacks in Germany, but only succeeded a couple of times because, as Freeman Dyson put it, it's like a hole-in-one. With conventional bombs, with firebombs, very hard to get a firestorm. And the firestorm is one so wide over an area that it creates its own updraft and creates its own weather, and it brings winds in, which are like a bellows on a fireplace, which raise the temperatures extremely high, kill everyone in that area, and have another effect that they didn't consider at that time. But in that area, everything goes. It consumes the oxygen in shelters, so people suffocate in the shelters. The intensity is such that when people left the shelters in Tokyo, which was a firestorm we created just after Dresden firestorm and earlier the British Hamburg firestorm, the Tokyo firestorm, which took 300 bombs, melted the asphalt on the streets, so people who left the shelters found themselves mired in the asphalt, and the heat from the tidal wave of flames that were coming at them put them on fire before the actual flames arrived. So they died in the asphalt. But many of them, thousands, went to canals, which crisscrossed Tokyo, to escape the heat, and jumped in. And tens of thousands boiled in the canals because the canals were boiled to death. Could go into more of that, but the reason I made that point is that was a night when the Americans killed 100,000 people in one night. The biggest act of terrorism, killing of civilians, in human history in one night. So Truman had answered that question. I'm sorry, correction, FDR, but he was Franklin Roosevelt, but he wasn't even brought in on it. It was all done at a lower level, but definitely no objection to it at the higher level by Simpson or others. When it was discovered that we had killed 100,000 people, and no suggestions of 𝗘𝗹𝗍𝗀𝗍𝗀, then the general in charge, that he should not do what he did set out to do, which was to try to do the same thing to the next 64 cities. Before Hiroshima, then, we had killed 900,000 Japanese civilians burned to death in this way. Before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bring it up to about 1.2 million. The point is, our presidents were, it became Truman in the course of that, were tested on the question, would they kill 100,000 people? And although they never achieved it again, because for various reasons, but they didn't achieve it. They did kill, as I say, over 1 million people. The A-bomb itself can do that virtually every time. Actually, it didn't do it in Nagasaki for geographic reasons, but in Hiroshima it did. Larger H-bombs, the H-bombs would do that every time, and now would have an effect that they hadn't looked at till 1983. Not only would create great temperatures on the face of the Earth, the rising column of air would actually propel soot and smoke into the stratosphere, where it wouldn't rain out, and would go around the globe by perhaps 150 million tons of it, would go around the world quickly within a matter of days, blocking out sunlight to an extent of 70% and creating ice age conditions on the Earth, which would freeze rivers, freeze lakes, but in particular would kill all harvests. World supply of food, I'm told, is about 60 days worth, although it's concentrated in certain areas. So places like the US that export food would stop exporting and it would take them longer to starve, but less than a year. And the other places would go through an agonizing process of fighting for food, fighting for water, and starving within about a year. It would probably not lead to extinction. So Toby Ord, in effect, as I read the book, in his book, The Precipice, pushes that off and says, well, that's not the subject of this book. I'm interested, says Ord, in questions of what would actually cause extinction. And this isn't one of them. He makes the same conclusion about climate change, which is on the way. It'd be terrible. He doesn't say it's not anything, it's anything but terrible. But having looked at it in quite detail, it's not the focus of this book, so let's move on. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, various things that just might possibly lead to extinction. And he admits that nuclear winter might possibly lead to extinction, but probably not. I am dumbfounded by spending space on a discussion like that to only to say, that's not the problem for him. It is the problem I've been thinking about for 60 years, trying to understand how we came to that. And I come back saying 100,000, that's World War II. That's what we did last time. 100,000 has nothing to do with what would happen if a UK Trident submarine released its mere 40, let alone what it could load at, missiles. How does it explain doing that exactly? Well, of course, let's move to the US. The US has, of course, close to 100 times that, about 3,000 operational weapons, 1,550 on alert, as does the Russia. Hair trigger alert, each capable of causing on its own nuclear winter. The US, the UK plans, and others are totally integrated with this. And the umbrella that they're talking about is the acceptance of a threat and a preparation and a constant conscious risk that is more than zero of causing nuclear winter, murdering close to 7 billion people, 7 billion. Or India and Pakistan threaten a much lower level of nuclear winter that would starve between 1 and 2 billion. The fact that we have reached that, starting with the US and imitated then by Russia, is a moral catastrophe. Does any country have a right to have the capability, let alone the will, to threaten and plan and prepare contingently for killing 1 billion people, not 100,000, 100 million, 500 million, name it. That's where we are, with good intentions, of course, the kind that pave the road to hell. And that's the road we're on. Unless we change drastically our whole militarist, exterminist, as Edward Thompson called it, readiness to prepare and contemplate the extermination of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people. We're on that road, and we live with that constant. As I say, it is a moral catastrophe as a preparation without its being used. Will a species and a country that's willing to prepare in that way refrain from carrying out those wills? I thought then not, and I still think that we are moving in that direction still. The US is modernizing its whole doomsday machine, as is the Soviet Union, Russia now, sorry, and others, to do this unconscionably. Britain is considering now it's much lower. The world would be very much safer if the US and Russia were at the level of Britain and France. Much safer. And so I'm not singling Britain out by any means. On the contrary, it seems essential to me to get down first to the level of China and then a little lower to the level of UK and Britain, at least on the way to a world in which these weapons are totally eliminated. But that's not where we're going. As I understand it, even Britain is talking about increasing its relatively very small arsenal compared to ours, increasing it by 50 weapons, not going down. The thing about it is, will that change? Does that increase the risk of the world? No. But it forecloses reducing it. It forecloses the idea of increasing that, precludes the state of mind and mobilization that would lead to actually reducing that threat, as could be done, just as our increase in emissions from year to year to year of fossil fuel emissions into the world is, above all, going in the wrong direction, failing to reduce it. Okay, I've used my time up, and I know you've been looking at the right questions all day, and I leave you with the thought, yes, there is one more way to shame our species. Is it capable of shame to that degree? We haven't shown it, but my hope lies in what I'm doing, which is continuing to try to warn people in the hope that it will change things. It's not, it's a way of acting. It's a way of acting. I think that's what hope is. And I urge you to join me in that, to turn this arc, as Khrushchev called it, our arc, around. Keep it from being the Titanic heading into the ice at full speed, which is now a better metaphor, but to turn that around. Thank you.
Mr. Ellsberg, thank you for your concluding remarks. As someone who has grown up in a Pakistani city, miles away from the Indian border, the threat of nuclear conflict personally has a lot of resonance for me. More generally, though, for the thousands of students and academics who are subscribed to this event, I'm sure that they can't thank you enough, not just for your public service over the last several decades, but also your consistent insistence on using the platforms that you have available to consistently sound the alarm. But I don't want people to leave away with a sense of impossibility, with a sense of pessimism. And here I'm reminded of the words of John Emery, one of the most famous Holocaust survivors, who famously said that the impossibility of being a Jew created the necessity of being one. And that is perhaps how we should think about these risks, that we should generate a necessity within us as a collective human civilization to turn this arc of human civilization towards better times as opposed to towards darker times in terms of extinction. More generally, I would like to thank our partners for this entire summit, the LSE Effective Altruism Group, and also the LSE Public Debates Platform. I would like to thank Mr. Ellsberg and the numerous speakers who have spoken at this summit to sound the alarm on the catastrophic risks that we face as a civilization. This is us sounding off. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we hope to continue to use the platforms we have available to bring these interests to you that are central to the global public interest. Thank you very much.